The transport ship roared above the forest canopy of Jotara 9, a humid world where storms struck without pattern and the ground pulsed with hidden toxins. 30 cadets from across the Galactic Academy disembarked under a sky of dull orange clouds. They came from 15 different species, scaled, feathered, furred, and bare-skinned, and all had one purpose: to complete the notorious survival gauntlet. The challenge was simple on paper: endure 3 months in total isolation with minimal supplies. In reality, it was a brutal test of instinct, discipline, and endurance. Among them was Lieutenant Harris, a human from Earth, the only one of his kind in the entire cohort. He stepped onto the wet ground, his boots sinking slightly into the mud, and looked around at his fellow cadets who were already erecting makeshift shelters with sleek, alien precision. He felt the eyes of a dozen species on him, some curious, others doubtful. Humans were known for their reckless bravery, but few considered them methodical survivors. Harris knew that before long, the planet would reveal who truly understood survival. By nightfall, the first storm came. Acidic rain hissed against the leaves, and the sky screamed with lightning so close that the ground vibrated. The cadets scattered into their shelters, most of which collapsed before dawn. When the sun rose, several tents had melted, synthetic fabrics fused into useless clumps. A group of reptilian cadets argued over faulty equipment, their protective scales blistered from exposure. The air smelled of sulfur and burnt ozone. Harris had avoided using standard issue materials altogether. He had spent the night under a crude lean-to made of broad, waxy leaves layered over a frame of twisted vines that he had tested for resistance. The structure dripped but held. When he stepped out in the morning, the other cadets stared at him, astonished that he looked more annoyed than injured. The second day brought worse news. Supplies had begun to rot. The ration bars designed for humid climates dissolved in the acidic mist. Water purifiers malfunctioned. Several cadets fell ill from drinking unfiltered rainwater, believing their species' immune systems would adapt. One by one, distress beacons lit up as groups signaled for extraction. The Academy's instructors, observing from orbit, noted each call with growing concern. By the end of the first week, more than half the cadets had abandoned the mission. Some were airlifted in silence, their faces hidden behind helmets of shame. A few tried to persuade Harris to join them, but he refused. He told them simply, "If the storm is stronger than me, I'll know soon enough, but I haven't seen proof yet." On the 9th day, the forest began to reclaim the abandoned camp. The acidic rains ate through metal supports, leaving warped skeletons of structures like bones half buried in the mud. Harris spent the day moving through the ruins, collecting what he could salvage: insulated cables, fragments of solar panels, bits of polymer crates. He had no plan yet beyond one unshakable instinct: to stay. He was aware that every camera from the orbital station above was trained on him. The Academy always recorded its gauntlets for later analysis, but Harris was beginning to realize that he might end up the only story worth watching. The forest itself was a living maze. The trees exhaled heat, and the roots moved beneath the surface like muscles. Insects the size of a man's fist clung to every surface, their bodies armored and iridescent. Harris learned quickly to move quietly and to breathe through his sleeve when the pollen clouds passed, as the air could turn caustic in seconds. He cut his way through the undergrowth, using a jagged piece of metal he had shaped into a crude knife, marking trees with symbols only he would recognize. By the second week, he had mapped out a rough circle of safe ground around the camp and had identified a small creek that carried relatively clean water. At night, the loneliness pressed in harder than the darkness. The forest glowed faintly with bioluminescent spores, painting everything in cold blue light. He often sat by his flickering fire, one of the few he managed to ignite using friction and dry moss, listening to the distant cries of creatures he could not see. Sometimes he spoke aloud, narrating what he had learned that day, as if teaching an invisible class. "Rainwater can be made drinkable if filtered through the ground moss first," he muttered one night, jotting notes on a flattened piece of bark with charcoal. "Vines with purple veins are acid-proof. Leaf resin from the northern trees neutralizes burns." The habit of speaking aloud made him feel less like a survivor and more like an instructor documenting lessons for future students who might never arrive. The orbital supervisors debated whether to intervene. Officially, the trial had ended for everyone except Harris. Some argued it was pointless to let him continue. Others, intrigued by the data, decided to observe longer, Weeks passed, and the human did not falter. He began constructing a sturdier structure in the center of the clearing, not just for himself, but large enough for others. He reinforced the walls with layered bark and lined the roof with thick vines coated in mud for insulation. Each new feature was a solution to a problem he had already encountered. When the rains returned, his shelter remained standing. The structure became more than protection. It was proof that the environment could be understood rather than fought. Once, during the third week, a storm tore through the valley, and lightning struck close enough to ignite a fallen tree. Instead of running, Harris used the opportunity. He dragged the flaming branches into a pit and covered them with stones, creating a heat reserve that lasted through the cold nights. The next morning, the forest steamed in silence. From orbit, the instructors watched the single human moving between glowing stones and thick smoke, unaware that his endurance was rewriting the very definition of the Gauntlet. Harris began to notice patterns in the environment, subtle changes in color, sound, and air pressure that foretold storms or the migration of predators. He carved symbols on a flat rock to keep track of them, creating what he called a language of the forest. It was primitive, but it worked. When he stepped back and looked at the drawings, it almost resembled a lesson board. He laughed quietly to himself, realizing he was building a curriculum out of survival. Somewhere deep in his mind, a thought had begun to grow. If he could survive here, perhaps he could teach others to do the same. By the end of the month, all communication from orbit had gone silent. The Academy had stopped sending status updates, perhaps expecting him to fail. Harris no longer cared. His camp had become his classroom, and every problem was an exam. His body had hardened, his movements had grown deliberate, and his fear had turned into calculation. When a swarm of needlewings attacked, he did not flee. He covered himself in mud and waited still until they dispersed, learning that motion triggered their aggression. When food ran low, he discovered that certain tree pods could be roasted safely to remove toxins. Each discovery reinforced his growing conviction that survival was less about strength and more about understanding. Then one morning, as he prepared to check his traps along the creek, a shadow crossed the clearing. A small orbital shuttle descended through the mist and hovered above the camp. For a moment, he thought the instructors had come to retrieve him by force. But when the ramp opened, two figures emerged, an insectoid engineer with transparent wings and an avian medic with dull copper feathers. Both carried supplies and stood uncertainly at the edge of the clearing. Harris blinked in disbelief. The insectoid saluted awkwardly and said through a translator device, "Permission to rejoin the trial, Lieutenant." Harris didn't answer immediately. He simply smiled, gestured toward the shelter behind him, and replied, "Welcome to class." The forest wind carried the sound of distant thunder as the two cadets stepped forward, their eyes wide with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Harris turned back to his campfire, fed it with a few more dry twigs, and watched the flames catch. He realized that the trial was no longer about endurance or survival. It had become something entirely different, an education written in sweat, smoke, and patience. Above the clouds, the instructors who still watched in silence would later mark this day as the turning point. The moment when one human, left alone in the wild, decided that knowledge, not fear, was the real tool for survival. Harris spent the next several days reorganizing everything he had built. Now that two more cadets had joined him, his work was no longer about simple survival. It became about structure, something that could last and be understood by others. The insectoid engineer, whose name was Kale, was methodical and quiet, constantly sketching strange hexagonal patterns in the dirt, while the avian medic, Arya, was more emotional, fascinated by how the human had managed to live so long without assistance. Harris gave them no speeches, no orders. Instead, he assigned tasks as if this were an unspoken agreement among equals. Kale focused on shelter reinforcement using his species' resin secretion, which hardened like stone when dry. Arya gathered herbs and fungi, studying their chemical balance to create safe food sources. Harris spent his days designing something entirely new, a system. He began by flattening a wide stretch of land near the creek, clearing away branches and roots. Using a shard of metal, he drew a series of circles in the dirt, marking where future shelters would stand, where a communal fire pit would go, and where they would store food. It looked less like a camp and more like the blueprint of a small settlement. When Arya asked him why he was expanding when there were only 3 of them, he simply replied, "Because others will come. They just don't know it yet." His tone was calm but certain, as if he were reading a law of nature rather than expressing hope. Cale, whose kind admired precision, offered to calculate load-bearing angles for the structures. Harris accepted the help without hesitation. The once ruined field began to take shape under their combined effort. Days turned into weeks. The three of them worked in harmony, each contributing something unique. Kyle's resin sealed cracks between bark planks, making the walls waterproof. Arya used heated stones to sterilize water, creating the first safe drinking supply. Harris taught them how to weave vines into cord and how to store fire in a clay pot by burying embers under ash. He called it the lesson of continuity, the idea that no knowledge should die between storms. Every night after dinner, Harris gathered the two cadets around the fire and recited what they had learned that day. He had begun to document everything on bark tablets bound together by vines, writing in a mix of human English and pictographs that Cale invented. It looked crude, but it was effective. At night, when the others slept, Harris often sat outside, looking at the stars. He had started to imagine what this place could become. The forest, once hostile, had begun to feel like a teacher with difficult lessons. The sound of the creek had become familiar, almost comforting. He realized he no longer feared the planet. He respected it. What he wanted now was to prove that it could be mastered, not by domination, but by understanding. His thoughts drifted to the instructors in orbit. He wondered what they thought when they looked down and saw him. Perhaps a stubborn survivor, perhaps a fool. He didn't care. He wasn't building for their approval anymore. He was building for whoever came next. One morning, he woke to a faint sound that was not the forest, a shuttle descending. It landed awkwardly on the edge of the clearing, and a group of new cadets stepped out. Some were from the original team who had quit weeks ago. Others were volunteers who had requested to rejoin after seeing the broadcast of Harris's progress. The Academy had decided to reopen the trial unofficially, turning it into an observation experiment. A dozen cadets stood before him, hesitant and unsure. Their uniforms were cleaner, their equipment more advanced, but their faces carried the same uncertainty as before. Harris approached them slowly, his face covered in ash and dirt, his hands wrapped in cloth strips. "Welcome," he said simply. "You came here to survive. Let's start with living." The first few days were chaotic. The new arrivals brought arrogance and disbelief. Many mocked Harris's primitive methods, claiming they could last longer with technology. He didn't argue. He let the planet do the teaching. Within a week, their devices failed. The acidic air corroded circuitry, solar chargers fried under unpredictable lightning, and portable shelters collapsed under heavy rain. Those who had laughed soon found themselves around Harris's fire, hungry, wet, and humbled. When one of them asked why he hadn't warned them, he replied, "You wouldn't have listened. No one learns from being told. You learn when you build with your own hands." Once the arrogance faded, curiosity took its place. Harris began teaching systematically. Each morning he assigned lessons: water collection, fire maintenance, food identification, structural building, and navigation by sound and shadow. He had stopped thinking of the place as a camp. It was a school now. He called it the Circle, named after the fire that burned at its center. Kyle and Arya became his assistants. Kyle taught how to identify strong fibers for construction, while Arya demonstrated how to test for edible fungi without poisoning oneself. Harris oversaw it all, guiding rather than commanding. His presence was calm, yet his eyes carried authority born from survival, not rank. The cadets began to change. They stopped talking about their home planets and started talking about discoveries, how one could boil water in bark bowls, how vine sap could glue broken tools, how certain insects could be used as natural repellents. Each mistake became a lecture, each success a shared celebration. The human's simple notes evolved into a full manual written in multiple languages and symbols so that anyone, no matter the species, could understand. Harris drew diagrams of shelters, traps, and irrigation systems, adding annotations in Arya's neat handwriting. It was primitive science, but it worked. One evening, as the rain drummed against the roof, a dispute broke out between two cadets, a feline species warrior and a reptilian engineer. The argument was about resource control, each claiming ownership of a section of stored food. Harris intervened quietly. He didn't raise his voice or threaten punishment. He simply told them both to follow him outside. He led them to the creek, where the rain was turning the water into foam. "You see this," he said. "The creek doesn't argue with the rain. It moves with it. You both can do the same. Build together, or you'll both drown when the next storm comes." Then he walked away. The next morning, the two cadets had repaired the storage hut together without another word. By the third month, the transformation was complete. What began as scattered shelters had become a functioning settlement with pathways, communal areas, and signal towers made from hollowed trees. Harris established a schedule: dawn for gathering, midday for building, dusk for sharing knowledge. The forest that once symbolized chaos now echoed with purposeful movement. When he stood at the center of the camp one evening, watching Kyle inspect structures while Arya handed out medicinal tea to exhausted students, Harris felt a quiet satisfaction. He had not only survived, he had created order where none existed. Yet he knew this was only the beginning. The Academy would soon intervene, and the world beyond the forest would take interest. He could sense it in the way drones occasionally passed overhead, recording every detail. He wondered if the instructors realized that what was happening here was no longer a test. The cadets who had returned were no longer the same beings who had fled. They had learned unity, patience, and respect for what they could not control. Harris stood before the main shelter as the fire's glow illuminated his weathered face. "It's not about surviving anymore," he whispered to himself. "It's about teaching survival to outlast us." That night, the wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of distant rain. He looked toward the sky, knowing that another storm was coming. Instead of fear, he felt anticipation. The next morning, he would begin the next lesson: how to rebuild faster after destruction. He smiled faintly, realizing that every storm was another teacher, every failure another page in his growing book of survival. The circle was no longer just a camp on a forgotten planet. It was the beginning of something far greater, an idea strong enough to outlive the trial, the academy, and even himself. By the time the next storm arrived, the camp was no longer a fragile arrangement of shelters and smoke. It had become a living organism. The circle, as Harris named it, pulsed with activity from dawn to dusk. Paths were lined with polished stones to prevent mudslides. Watchtowers of woven wood rose above the tree line, and simple drums hung from branches to signal danger or gatherings. For the first time since the trial had begun, the cadets didn't dread the rain. They worked through it, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Harris had stopped counting the days. His beard had grown coarse and streaked with silver dust from the ash, and his once standard-issue uniform had been replaced by stitched hide and vine cloth. He had become part of the forest, not its guest. The group had grown to 25. More cadets had requested to rejoin, intrigued by what the Academy feeds showed from orbit. The instructors had stopped calling it a survival trial. The official documents now referred to the project as Human-Led Adaptation Experiment J9. But for those on the ground, titles no longer mattered. Harris spent his mornings walking through the settlement, observing how the different species interacted. He took note of which cadets worked best together, who still carried fear, and who had learned patience. He wasn't leading them in the traditional sense anymore. He was shaping them. One morning, Kyle approached him with a plan sketched on a flat piece of bark. The insectoid engineer had designed a new type of structure, something like a communal hall built partly underground, resistant to storms and stable in the heat. The resin Kyle produced would form the core walls, while Harris's clay ovens could keep the air inside warm. Harris studied the drawing in silence, tracing the edges with his finger, then nodded slowly. "Build it," he said. Kyle tilted his head, his translucent wings flickering with excitement. Within days, half the camp began hauling stones and branches, guided by Harris's quiet supervision. Arya managed food supplies and organized groups to collect edible roots and mushrooms. The work bonded everyone stronger than words ever could. While the haul rose, Harris noticed something subtle, discipline born from pride. The cadets were no longer motivated by orders or threats. They worked because they wanted to see what was possible. He found it remarkable how quickly chaos had transformed into unity once purpose replaced fear. In the evenings, he often stood near the creek, watching reflections ripple across the water, wondering how long it would last before the Academy intervened. He knew the Galactic Council wouldn't ignore what was happening here. It was too unconventional, too human. Yet the thought didn't worry him. For the first time in his life, Harris felt that his work belonged to something beyond the reach of bureaucracy. One afternoon, the camp faced its first real crisis since becoming a settlement. A group of cadets exploring beyond the perimeter returned injured and shaken. They had been attacked by a massive predator, a creature covered in black scales with a mouth like an opening furnace. It had torn through trees as if they were grass. 2 were missing. Panic spread fast. Some wanted to abandon the area and retreat toward higher ground. Harris listened to every voice but remained calm. He walked to the center of the circle and said in his steady, low tone, "If we move, the forest wins. We've built too much to run now. We adapt." His words silenced the argument. That night, he gathered Kale, Arya, and the most capable cadets to plan defenses. Harris devised traps using tension vines and sharpened stakes. Kale reinforced the walls with extra resin, and Arya distributed antidotes for venomous bites just in case. They organized night watches, setting fires along the perimeter to deter the beast. For 2 nights, nothing happened. On the third, the roar echoed from the darkness. The ground trembled as the creature approached. Harris stood at the front with a burning spear in hand, his eyes fixed on the tree line. The cadets waited behind him, hearts pounding. When the creature lunged, it triggered one of Kale's traps. Vines snapped upward, binding its legs, while Harris drove the spear into its chest. The impact sent him backward, but the creature fell with a crash that shook the camp. The cadets swarmed in, finishing the job with precision. When it was over, silence returned, heavy and absolute. Harris rose, bruised but smiling faintly. "Lesson learned," he said. "No classroom teaches fear like this one." After the battle, something changed in the way the cadets looked at him. It wasn't worship, it was understanding. He had risked his life without hesitation, and in doing so, proved that his lessons were more than theory. That night, they butchered the creature for meat and materials, fashioning armor and tools from its bones and scales. The forest had tested them, and they had answered with unity. Harris spent the following days documenting everything. He drew diagrams of the trap mechanism, the anatomy of the creature, and the tactics they used to defeat it. His journal had become a living record of adaptation. Weeks passed, and the camp continued to evolve. The new hall was completed, its interior warm and lined with dried leaves. It became a place not just for rest, but for teaching. Harris began holding evening gatherings there. Each night, a different cadet would stand before the group and explain something new they had discovered. One spoke about using beetle shells to create natural lenses that magnified light. Another described how to weave fibers into waterproof cloth. Harris listened, correcting gently when necessary, always encouraging them to think beyond instinct. "Every idea you share keeps someone else alive," he said more than once. Arya began keeping her own medical journal, which Harris reviewed occasionally. She experimented with herbal mixtures and found a way to reduce infection from cuts using crushed spores mixed with clean ash. Harris praised her ingenuity, calling it medicine born of survival. Kale continued to design improvements for the camp, from irrigation ditches to smoke channels that carried heat efficiently through the shelters. Harris had started something unstoppable. Each success inspired a dozen new ones, but the forest was unpredictable, and it never allowed comfort for long. One morning, the sun rose blood red through the mist. The air felt heavy, and insects hid under leaves, a sign Harris recognized as danger. By midday, the wind turned scorching, carrying with it the smell of burning resin. A wildfire, ignited by lightning far to the west, was approaching fast. Flames raced along the treetops, feeding on the oily bark. The cadets panicked, unsure whether to stay or flee. Harris took command immediately. He ordered trenches dug along the perimeter and directed everyone to create fire breaks by cutting down nearby brush. The hall became the central shelter, sealed with wet clay. The firestorm hit by nightfall. Sparks rained from the sky like molten rain. Harris moved from group to group, making sure everyone followed the plan. When smoke filled the camp, he covered his mouth with a damp cloth and kept shouting instructions until his voice broke. The fire raged for hours, but the trenches and fire breaks held. By dawn, the flames had moved past them, leaving behind scorched earth and ash. The camp was damaged, but intact. Exhausted and covered in soot, Harris collapsed near the creek, laughing hoarsely. Arya knelt beside him, pressing a damp cloth to his forehead. "You could have burned alive," she said softly. He looked at her and replied with a grin. "So could the forest." But it didn't. After the fire, something remarkable happened. The land began to heal faster than anyone expected. New shoots sprouted through the ash within days, vibrant green against the blackened soil. Harris realized that the destruction had cleared space for renewal. He gathered everyone and said, "The forest burns itself to start again. We should do the same. We'll rebuild stronger." Under his direction, they redesigned the camp layout, widening paths, rebuilding with stone foundations instead of wood, and using the creature's bones to reinforce structures. The fire had nearly destroyed them, but it became the catalyst for evolution. As the weeks turned into months, Harris noticed fewer drones overhead. The Academy's interest seemed to fade, or perhaps the instructors had no idea how to categorize what they were witnessing. The trial had long ceased to be a test. It had become civilization in miniature. One night, as he sat alone near the creek, Harris opened his worn notebook and added a final note to that day's entry. The purpose of survival is not to endure, it's to create something worth enduring for. He closed the book and looked at the distant stars shimmering through the rising mist. He had come to this planet to prove his endurance, but now he realized he was proving something far greater, that knowledge and unity could turn even the harshest wilderness into a home. Months had passed since the Great Fire, and the settlement that had once been nothing more than a desperate experiment had become something extraordinary. The forest around it no longer felt hostile, but alive with purpose. The soil, blackened by ash, had grown fertile, and small gardens stretched along the creek's edge where crops of alien roots and Earth-origin herbs grew side by side. The cadets had long ceased calling themselves cadets. They referred to themselves as builders, learners, or simply by name. The circle had become a community, and Harris, though never self-proclaimed, was its center, the quiet force holding it together. He had stopped teaching basic survival long ago. Now he was teaching creation, how to shape the environment rather than merely adapt to it. Every morning, as the mist lifted from the trees, Harris walked the perimeter of the settlement, noting changes in the land. He spoke less now, communicating mostly through gestures and nods. He had become a figure of calm authority. The others looked to him not as a commander, but as something older, almost mythic, a man who listened to the world and understood its rhythm. His focus had shifted from leading to passing on leadership. He wanted this place to exist without him. Kyle and Arya had become his two closest partners in this silent transformation. Kyle managed construction, overseeing the design of new buildings that now had curved walls mimicking the forest's natural flow. Arya oversaw health, organizing a small medical hut where she treated burns, infections, and births of strange hybrid crops that had begun mutating under the planet's unique radiation. One day, Harris gathered everyone at the central hall. The air outside was cool, and the light filtered through the resin-coated walls, casting amber tones across the faces of those seated. He stood before them, holding a carved wooden board, the first map of their world. The circles of their settlement were drawn clearly at the center, with lines extending toward unexplored regions. "We have done more than survive," he said, his voice steady and low. "We have built the foundation of something new, but the forest stretches farther than we've dared to see. I want teams to go beyond our borders, to map, to learn, and to bring back knowledge." A murmur spread through the hall, part excitement, part apprehension. For months, the forest beyond had been avoided, seen as both sacred and dangerous. Yet under Harris's gaze, fear turned into curiosity. He assigned Kale to lead one group north and Arya to lead another south. He would remain behind to manage the camp and record their findings. The following days were filled with preparation. Rope was coiled, flint knives sharpened, and supplies divided. Harris helped each team design simple signal markers in case of emergency. 3 piles of stones for distress, a spiral pattern for success. He spent the last evening with Kyle and Arya by the fire. The flames danced in the resin bowl, their faces illuminated in soft orange. Kale tapped his claws against the ground nervously, while Arya's feathers trembled slightly each time the wind blew. "The forest won't hurt you if you listen," Harris said. "Remember, it isn't an enemy. It's a teacher. Treat it with respect, and it will show you what it hides." His words carried the weight of belief, not command. When the dawn came, the 2 groups departed, disappearing silently into the mist. For the first time in months, the circle was quiet. The absence of Kale's rhythmic construction sounds and Arya's melodic voice left a strange emptiness. Harris spent the mornings alone by the creek, writing in his journal. His handwriting had grown rough, his thoughts deeper. He no longer recorded simple facts. He wrote philosophies. Survival ends where curiosity begins. One entry read, "To live is to build meaning, not walls." At night, he sat under the glowing fungi trees, staring at the stars. Sometimes he wondered whether the Academy still watched from orbit. He suspected they did, but he no longer cared. His purpose had moved beyond their evaluations. 3 weeks passed before the first signal came. From the northern ridge, smoke rose in a tight, deliberate spiral, the mark of success. Kale had returned. His group came back with bags full of stone samples and seeds of a plant that grew where the soil was almost frozen. He explained that it contained minerals that could neutralize acid rain when burned. Harris examined the samples and smiled faintly. "You've brought the forest's answer to our first question," he said. Kale lowered his head modestly, the tips of his wings fluttering. Later that evening, when Arya's team returned from the south, they carried something even stranger, a small creature that looked like a cross between a rodent and a plant, its skin photosynthetic, glowing faintly in the dark. Arya placed it gently on the table. "It reacts to light," she said. "It drinks sunlight like we drink water." Harris watched the creature curl into a ball and then unfold again when the firelight touched it. "Life adapts to every cruelty," he murmured. "We can learn from that." That night, the hall was alive with stories. Kale described caves filled with crystals that hummed under pressure, while Arya spoke of plants that sang at dusk when the wind passed through their hollow stems. Harris listened to every detail, engraving each word into memory. He realized that the circle had evolved into something far beyond his original vision. It wasn't just a survival school, it was a laboratory of understanding, a place where knowledge was forged through collaboration between species that had once mistrusted each other. As the others laughed and shared food, he sat a little apart, smiling faintly, but already thinking of what would come next. Over the following weeks, he began formalizing their discoveries. He divided the settlement into sections: agriculture, engineering, medicine, and culture. Every skill had to be taught and recorded. He built shelves from woven wood to store the growing collection of bark tablets and notes. He told Kale to train apprentices in construction and encouraged Arya to teach basic healing techniques to others. Soon, the hall buzzed with activity at all hours. Children of different species who had never spoken before were now learning side by side. Harris often stood at the doorway, watching them in silence. It felt unreal, as if the planet itself had rewritten the rules of civilization under his guidance. But the balance of progress brought new challenges. The more they built, the more resources they consumed. The forest began showing signs of resistance. Fewer edible roots, more aggressive predators, sudden weather shifts that seemed almost deliberate. Harris noticed patterns that unsettled him. The land responded to their expansion as if testing whether they had learned moderation. One night, as he studied the glowing map carved into the wooden board, he realized that survival wasn't just about creation, it was about restraint. "We can't take everything," he said to Kyle the next morning. "We must give back." He ordered the establishment of conservation zones, forbidding hunting or harvesting in certain areas. He taught composting, water cycling, and seed replanting. The cadets obeyed, not because they feared punishment, but because they trusted him. Then came a moment that changed everything. A supply shuttle from the academy broke through the clouds and descended into the clearing without warning. The engines scattered dust and ash as the ramp lowered. A group of uniformed officers stepped out, their faces hidden behind helmets. The sight froze the camp. Harris walked forward slowly, unarmed. One officer spoke through an amplifier. "Lieutenant Harris, the experiment is over. You are to return for debriefing." His voice echoed across the silent settlement. Harris looked around at the faces of his people, Kale, Arya, and the others who had built their lives here. "There's no experiment here," he said calmly. "Only life." The officer hesitated. He repeated the order. Harris didn't move. The cadets began to gather behind him, forming a wall of quiet defiance. No one spoke, but the message was clear. The standoff lasted several minutes until the officer stepped back and signaled the shuttle to lift off. The engines roared again, and the ship rose, disappearing into the clouds. Harris stood motionless, his gaze following the trail of smoke until it vanished. When the sound faded, he turned back to the group and said simply, Now they know we don't belong to them anymore." The camp erupted in quiet applause, not loud, not triumphant, but filled with deep pride. That night, as the fires burned around the settlement, Harris wrote one final entry for the day. "A school is not a place. It's a promise that knowledge must continue even when no one is watching." He closed the book and stepped outside. The stars above shimmered like distant embers, and the forest around him swayed softly in the night breeze. Cale approached and handed him a small piece of carved wood, a miniature replica of the circle's symbol. Harris took it, turning it over in his hand. "For the record," Cale said quietly. Harris smiled. "No," he replied. "For the future." The two stood there in silence, watching the glowing canopy move like the breath of a sleeping world, knowing that what they had built would outlast all trials, all storms, and even the names of those who started it. The seasons on Jotara 9 did not follow the logic of other worlds. The forest shifted its colors not once a year, but whenever the planet's twin moons aligned, painting the soil in silvers and greens that shimmered beneath the fog. Months had passed since the confrontation with the Academy shuttle, and the circle had become something larger than even Harris had imagined. The settlement now extended beyond the creek and into the lower ridges, where terraced gardens caught rainfall and fed a network of channels that shimmered like veins through the landscape. Communication towers made from resin and metal fragments reached upward, not to contact the orbiting supervisors, but to signal new communities that had begun to form nearby. Satellite groups founded by former cadets who had chosen to remain and teach. The circle had become a seed, and the planet itself was now the garden. Harris spent his mornings walking along the high ridge where the air was cool and quiet. He had built a small hut there, away from the noise of the settlement, a place to think and write. His hair had grown longer, streaked with white, and his skin had darkened under the alien sun. He still carried the same worn journal, though its pages were nearly filled. Each line was written with the same deliberate care, thoughts, instructions, reflections. He rarely spoke of the past anymore. The academy, the trial, even the word cadet had faded from his vocabulary. His focus was only forward, toward preservation. He knew that someday he would no longer be there to guide them, and that every word he left behind had to serve as foundation. Cale had taken charge of most construction, and under his precise supervision, new halls rose like extensions of the forest itself. Arya had built a small infirmary that doubled as a classroom for medicine. She trained new healers using local plants, combining alien science with what Harris once called Earth logic. Simple, observation-based reasoning. The students adored her calmness and humor, though her eyes sometimes revealed a quiet sadness when she spoke of Harris. She had noticed how much older he looked lately, how he lingered by the creek longer each evening, staring at his reflection in silence. She worried, but never pressed him with questions. He always smiled when she approached and said, "Everything changes, Arya. That's what we built this place to teach." One morning, as the sun burned through the mist, a distant rumble echoed through the valley. A metallic shape appeared in the sky, a massive vessel, larger than any shuttle that had come before. The settlement froze in silence as its shadow crossed the treetops. Harris watched from the ridge, eyes narrowing. This was not a resupply craft. The ship bore the insignia of the Galactic Council. He descended slowly, his steps deliberate. By the time he reached the central clearing, the vessel had landed, crushing a field of herbs beneath its landing struts. The ramp opened, and a delegation emerged, officers in polished armor, followed by a woman wearing the white emblem of the Council's Education Division. Her face was calm, but distant. She looked at Harris and said, "Lieutenant Harris, you are summoned. The Council wishes to acknowledge your contribution." The cadets, no, the citizens of the circle gathered behind him. No one spoke. The woman continued, "You have turned a failed trial into a sustainable society. The Council wishes to reinstate you and relocate your project under official supervision. Your students will receive rank and funding. Your teachings will be standardized." Harris listened without interruption. His eyes were steady, his hands folded behind his back. When she finished, he asked quietly, "And what happens to this world when you standardize it?" The woman hesitated. "It will prosper," she replied. "Under order." Harris smiled faintly. Order without understanding is just another kind of failure. The council delegation stayed for 3 days. They recorded everything. the architecture, the farming systems, the cooperative structure, and presented documents filled with promises, academies, funding, recognition. Harris met with them every evening, but gave no answer. On the fourth day, he walked with Arya to the ridge, watching the ship glint under the rising sun. "They mean well," she said softly. "Perhaps they can help." Harris shook his head. "Help is not what we need. Help turns builders into students again. We have already learned how to live. We don't need permission to continue." Arya looked down, torn between hope and loyalty. "What will you tell them?" she asked. He smiled gently. "The truth." That evening, the councilwoman returned for his final decision. The settlement gathered silently as Harris stood before her. The wind carried the scent of resin and firewood. "When I arrived here," he began, "this place was nothing but storm and acid. Every life form fought to exist. We learned not by command, but by necessity. We built trust across species that once feared each other. What you see now is not the result of human intellect. It is the result of cooperation without hierarchy. If you take this and turn it into a program, you'll kill the spirit that created it." He paused, looking at the faces around him, Kyle's luminous eyes, Arya's trembling hands, the dozens of others who stood silently in the firelight. "You want to make this a school. It already is one, but it doesn't belong to me or to the council. It belongs to the world that taught us how to listen." The councilwoman said nothing for a long time. Finally, she nodded. "Then the council will classify this site as autonomous," she said. "You will not be disturbed again." Her voice carried a strange mixture of disappointment and respect. She turned and walked back toward the ship. The ramp closed, and the engines flared. The vessel rose into the sky, disappearing beyond the clouds. The crowd remained silent for several minutes after it was gone. Then Cale stepped forward and placed his hand on Harris's shoulder. "You spoke for all of us," he said quietly. Harris nodded, but there was no pride in his expression, only relief. In the months that followed, Harris withdrew from the daily work of the settlement. He spent most of his time writing, compiling everything he had learned into one complete record. The book became known as the Manual of the Circle. It contained not just survival techniques, but philosophies on cooperation, resilience, and respect for the unknown. He wrote in clear language, knowing it had to be understood by those who would come long after him. Arya visited often, bringing food, and gently scolding him for working too hard. He always laughed softly and promised to rest soon, though his body had grown frail. One night, under the twin moons, Harris gathered everyone in the central hall. He placed the completed book on the table, its bark cover bound with resin threads. "This is all I can give," he said. "Knowledge is only alive if it's shared. Each of you will take a part of it and teach it forward. That's how the circle continues." His voice was calm, but there was finality in it. After the gathering, he walked to his hut on the ridge, carrying nothing but a small lantern. The next morning, Cale found the lantern still burning beside the doorway. Harris was sitting outside, facing the forest, his eyes closed, a faint smile on his lips. The wind stirred the leaves around him, whispering softly through the trees. His burial took place at the crest of the ridge. Arya placed his journal beside him, wrapped in cloth. Kyle carved the circle's symbol onto a stone and set it above the grave. No one spoke during the ceremony. The silence itself felt sacred. That evening, as dusk settled, the forest shimmered with bioluminescent light. The glowing plant creatures that Arya had once studied emerged from the shadows and gathered near the ridge, their bodies pulsing gently. It was as if the planet itself had come to pay respect. Years passed, and the circle endured. New leaders rose, guided by Harris's teachings. The settlement grew into a network of communities connected by shared principles rather than borders. The story of the human who stayed behind became legend across the galaxy, a man who turned a failed trial into a civilization. The Academy eventually sent envoys to study the Jotara model, but no one dared to alter it. The place was more than an experiment. It was a living testament to the idea that understanding could bridge any divide. And high on the ridge, where the wind carried the scent of rain and resin, the stone with the circle's mark remained untouched. Moss grew around it, and the forest reclaimed the path leading there. Yet those who climbed the hill could still find the spot and feel the quiet that Harris had left behind, a silence filled not with endings, but with peace. The circle continued to thrive, its fires burning under alien stars, teaching every new generation the same unspoken lesson that had begun with one human standing alone in the rain, that true survival was never about enduring the world, but learning how to live with it.